What's up, guys and gals of the movement world? It's Sean Mishka, the Movement Miyagi, coming to you again with another sport movement behavior deep dive. This time, instead of doing something American football oriented, as you can see from my title slide here, we're going to be diving into the upcoming matchup between Israel Adesanya, the last Stylebender, and Robert the Reaper Whittaker at UFC 271. Now, of course, being that this is a sport movement behavior deep dive, what we typically like to do is actually truly dive into movement behavior, right? In the unfolding and emerging and dynamic nature of that movement behavior. However, the UFC had a little other plans for me. I actually recorded about an hour and 5 minute video a few nights ago, and they claimed that it was copyright infringement because I was utilizing a video of theirs, obviously diving into a number of videos actually that they have publicly posted free as free fights, and I was publicly promoting their fight upcoming, but that's neither here nor there. I'll stay a little salty for the time being. So today it's going to be all still shot oriented, so I apologize for that in advance. I know that it would obviously be much more illustrative if we were able to actually take that deep dive through investigating, unfolding, and emerging in dynamic movement behavior. But hopefully you'll be able to get the deal anyway here and really be able to try to dive into that. So that is sort of my disclaimer that there are going to be some things that we may miss with still shots. However, I will post within the show notes of this video, I will post that free fight link to the UFC, and you'll be able to watch kind of like that, which what I am seeing as I give you my notes. If you want to go watch that video, I would highly recommend you do so. Okay, the fight from UFC 243, which we're going to dive into and kind of talk about what unfolded there, what really emerged there, and how the transactions of information, the transactions of movement behavior between performer and environment or problem and solver from both perspectives, Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker, how it unfolded and how it was mutually reciprocally connected to one another. Of course, my disclaimer is that I am not a mixed martial arts expert. I'm only a mixed martial arts practitioner and advocate, and I like to be able to utilize many martial arts ideas within my own craft within American football, as most of you probably know, specifically those from Bruce Lee, amongst many others. So if you want a better mixed martial arts expert explanation, as well as breakdown and analysis, I would highly recommend looking at the work of Dan Hardy in particular from Full Reptile. Dan Hardy is a tremendous mind. It's somebody that I've publicly kind of tried to lift up and give a little bit of kudos to, specifically on social media, because I just love and adore the way that he views the world. Highly ecological in his perspective, even though he may not use ecological dynamics oriented terminology. If you listen to anything he has to say, he's very much an ecological dynamics junkie, just without actually knowing it. And then the other individual would be Luke Thomas. Both of those guys will give you a much more informed perspective, specifically from a mixed martial arts analysis. But my analysis, much like it will with American football, be highly biased towards an ecological dynamics framework and applying that ecological dynamics framework to that which what we're seeing within the movement skill execution and within this movement behavior deep dive. I will also add another disclaimer in this, and many of you probably might recall that a number of years back in March of 2020, I actually did a movement analysis deep dive on the skill set and on the behaviors of Israel Adesanya, the last Stylebender. So I am going to be unapologetic about my biases towards him and his style, simply because I do believe that Israel Adesanya is one of the best examples that we may have of this really becoming one with the problem. And we're kind of expressing that oneness between oneself and their skill set and their solutions, and that which what the problem is asking of oneself. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit when we talk about the organismic constraints at play, but also as we really start to kind of peel back the layers and pull apart the curtain as to what unfolded in their UFC 243 meetup back in 2019. They being Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker, the guys who are going to be fighting next week. So what I will say is that when we look at mixed martial arts itself, the reason why I like to really dive into it and really get myself stuck in within it is because mixed martial arts really does begin to embrace this problem solver paradigm. The way one thinks, the way one acts, the way one behaves, and really the way that one acts within their craft. I believe that across sports, if we were to start to adopt a more mixed martial arts friendly approach, specifically, obviously, my biases towards Jeet Kune Do and Bruce Lee and his own and personal interpretation of the martial arts, we start to see that a style for oneself. We start to see an authenticity. We start to see this, again, this mutual reciprocal relationship between oneself and them finding their way within the world, and that world containing problems that are alive and unpredictable and complex and dynamic and emergent and all of that stuff that we typically will highlight in American football. Mixed martial arts, particularly at the highest levels, begin to really kind of illustrate that relationship really nicely and neatly for us. And it's why mixed martial arts particularly begins to speak to my own form of life. Also speaking to my form of life, that bias that I already had kind of talked about is the form of life of the last Stylebender, Israel Adesanya. And if you really think about what that name, the Stylebender, may imply or insinuate, is that kind of idea from Bruce Lee, one of those quotes that you hear me probably repeat more than you need to, which is the highest technique is to have no technique. My technique is the result of your technique, my movement being the result of your movement. I would argue that the last Stylebender, Israel Adesanya, and his movement skill and how he solves problems within his respective world, how he becomes one with the problem, and again, its opportunities, its needs, and its challenges, really what that problem is asking of him, is second to none. And I actually say that it's second to none, that dexterity, that ability to solve any emerging movement problem under any situation and condition, and this ability of those movements to unfold in interaction with that peculiar environment and problem, is second to none, not only in mixed martial arts and across combat sports, but I may make the argument, be able to make a pretty good argument, I believe, that his problem solver paradigm, his abilities and capabilities in solving a wide range of complex, dynamic, and emergent movement problems is second to none across all sports. And if you haven't watched any Israel Adesanya fights up to this point, again, even if you are not a mixed martial arts, if that's something that you don't actually usually gravitate to and you exist in a different sport, I would highly recommend finding some, not only highlights, but more specifically, full fights of Israel Adesanya. Not only his kickboxing career, and he had 80 fights, 75-5, I think is what he was as a professional kickboxer across multiple weight classes. And him fighting in multiple weight classes, even when he wasn't actually at the weight that the weight class required, which means that he was a middleweight fighting up, or I think they call it a cruiserweight in kickboxing, fighting heavyweights, fighting guys much bigger than him. So his ability to solve those problems, again, across a variety and diversity of problems, again, I believe it's almost second to none. And that's the reason why his style, that really is without style, if you really, when we look at what Jeet Kune Do is, to have no way is the way. I don't know if there's a better example of it across sports than Israel Adesanya. So watch one of his fights, see it unfold, and I would highly recommend, in order to truly see the levels of it, particularly how he's organizing and coordinating and controlling and then reorganizing, recoordinating, and recontrolling degrees of freedom perceptually, intentionally, and from a motor system perspective. You're going to see a high amount of authenticity. You're going to see a high amount of abundance and diversity in his strategies that sets the tone for this dexterity or this adaptability that he shows, this ability to have no way as the way, this ability to bend one's style, to kind of shape shift, if you will, as himself and his skill based on the opportunities in the world. A few of these still shots obviously came from the UFC 243 matchup back in October 2019 between Israel and Robert Whittaker. You see on the upper left-hand corner there, where you're seeing this feinting, faking game that really creates the platform for Israel Adesanya to do what he does. He uses it as a way to draw out attacks of his opponent, and he's using it in a way to perceive to act. Again, if someone is going to be the best example, or one of the most illustrative examples, at least for me in this idea of dexterity, that mentality of perceiving to act and acting to perceive is something that really has to be a trademark, a staple of what they do and how they do it. And Israel Adesanya certainly is that. So he will act in a given way without any intention of actually throwing the full action. So if you guys don't know what this feinting game really is about, he's doing it to detect information because it draws out behavioral responses from the opponent. And then even in the upper right-hand corner, where he's thrown out this jab where it looks like it's intending to hit, he's always using this as a measuring stick to see where he's at. Again, I don't believe in many of these cases he has a true intention of striking him. He's trying to get really sensitive, really attuned, particularly early on in fights, first minute and a half, 2 minutes. And once he kind of gets that fit and finds that feel of interpersonal distance, he uses that to inform and regulate his own actions. And then the bottom two pictures, like I said, he's always perceiving to act and acting to perceive. Look at the bottom left-hand corner. And if you haven't seen the fight, once you see it, you'll see exactly what I'm meaning or insinuating. He moves in a way where he's constantly changing his actions to allow for more enhanced information detection or more tuned and sensitive perception. So he's finding those opportunities. And as he does this, he's really just kind of like embracing the Gibson idea of using one's perception to regulate one's actions because you find new opportunities in the world. He's just kind of like finding his way there. And as he perceives, it allows him to pick up additional information about how he could subsequently act. And as he acts, meaning, and if you look at that bottom left-hand corner, how he moves here, you'll see him do that a lot. He's reorganizing his degrees of freedom perceptually to scaffold the intentions that he may have, so the decisions that he makes, the opportunities that are present, and the way he may act upon them. And there are times that he will act in very unorthodox manners, much like you see in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, to kind of lull guys into coming in his zone and acting in given ways. And we're going to illustrate all of these things. So if you guys want to know why I'm so much of a fan and on this Israel Adesanya last Stylebender bandwagon, these are a few of the reasons why. I will also put that movement analysis that I did prior to the Yoel Romero fight in March of 2020, now 2 years ago, even though his skill and his craft has evolved, I'll put that in the show notes as well. So going into the 2019 matchup, for those of you who aren't aware, I would again recommend that you go watch this. You had two guys at their prime. Now they're even more primed, I would make the argument, going into this fight. And we're going to talk about how those constraints have sort of evolved and how they may serve to channel that which what we see unfold. But Israel Adesanya being the interim champion at that point, undefeated, and Robert Whittaker hadn't lost in like 7 years. He was the undisputed champion, but he had had some time off. And going into this fight in particular, we find a few constraints that probably played or factored in against Robert Whittaker. And I'm just getting my notes out here to make sure that I don't misquote anything. This was the highest attended fight, and we're going to talk about that on the very next slide as to what platform or what palette was really set because of this. But it took place at Marvel Stadium in Australia. those of you who don't know, Israel Adesanya is from New Zealand and Robert Whittaker is from Australia. So there was a certain feel that Robert Whittaker was actually fighting for the entire country of Australia, especially when there is a little bit of rivalry between Australia and New Zealand. So this, again, kind of created the platform for some of that which what we saw unfold, not only within the fight, but also pre-fight. And in that pre-fight, we saw a lot of tension. We saw a lot of pressure that was maybe not necessarily typically felt by Robert Whittaker. Robert Whittaker usually is finding or coordinating a very functionally fit movement solution. But within this fight in particular, we saw degrees of freedom being fixed and frozen. Even before the fight, as I'm hoping to illustrate here, just from a few still shots, even in some of the pre-fight press conferences, we sort of see Izzy in this really honest and authentic and expressive manner that he possesses. We see it in the walkout when he did sort of this walkout for the ages, where it was like a full dance routine, kind of coming out and really just, again, honestly, authentically expressing himself, to use some of Bruce Lee's ideas. And I know it's very easy to see within Israel Adesanya's style. We're talking about a guy who really loves to dance, and obviously he embraced that really right from the start. He's like, this is my moment to take the reins and shine, not only in the middleweight division, but for the entire UFC at this time. And you see Robert Whittaker kind of like really tense, like really in his own head and in his own style, versus, you know, like even look at pre-fight there, Israel Adesanya doing his trademark pose with the cage, and he's literally like whooping, and I'm not exaggerating, he's like whooping like he's calling for Bigfoot, you know, like, come on over. It's just a really expressive and honest and flair to how he was behaving really from start to finish. And from everything from press conference to pre-fight, you saw kind of the weight on Robert Whittaker's shoulders. And he talks about this now, leading up into this UFC 271 fight. He talks about how he got in his own ego. Like, why does everyone think this guy is so great when I'm the undisputed champion? And he's this new up and comer. There's always new up and comers, like there will be in any sport. But then we saw Robert Whittaker pacing, like just feeling the weight of the moment. And the weight of that moment kind of channel, not kind of, it did channel that which what we see unfold and emerge once the fight began. Because once the fight began, we saw this intense and rushed nature from Robert Whittaker. And again, I apologize for the still shots. I actually did a really good breakdown, a really in-depth breakdown on the actual video itself that the UFC was not so keen on for whatever reason. But again, I'm going to stay salty throughout this entire video, and probably as I put this out and promote it as well. But you see Israel Adesanya in this constant feeling out process, specifically in the first half of the early round, or first half of this first round. That's what we typically will see from him. He's actually trying to go through his measuring stick. His interpersonal distance is definitely one of those key candidate control parameters for him and his system behavior. He's constantly throwing out this hand to kind of just get a feeler out there. If you don't, I should have mentioned it earlier, but Israel Adesanya is a super adept stance switcher. So he's constantly switching stances between orthodox, or left hand, left foot forward, or southpaw, right hand, right foot forward, ready to throw that left with power. But he's able to equally, again, with degeneracy or abundance with his strategies and system, kind of feel out from southpaw to orthodox. And if you've never seen the Israel Adesanya locomotive processes between that stance switching, again, that's true functional footwork expressed in an emergent fashion. Watch a few of the fights and you're going to see this unfold. But Robert Whittaker, really right from the start, look at the time here, okay? If you can, hopefully you can see my mouse, 442, 448, 448, right? All of that is really just kind of telling us what is going to be setting the tone. Again, this isn't the Robert Whittaker way, like where he's in a constant, like, almost overly aggressive. I'm trying to show you who I am. I'm trying to show the world who I am. And he was constantly blitzing. And he was coming in and out with reckless abandon, almost just looping punches, as we can see here. Okay, whereas typically Robert Whittaker is a very straight down the tunnel. Here he's just has a lot of sweeping type of actions, these big looping actions that for a guy like Israel Adesanya, that is all about perceiving to act and having a very sensitive perception. Pretty easy to figure out, okay? And in that feeling out process, Israel Adesanya gains that interpersonal distance sensitivity really right off the bat. We do see Israel start to mix in some actions with variability here right early on. But it's really, again, setting up the feints to set up further subsequent actions. And that's something we're going to talk about a bit coming on as well. Later in round one, and again, hopefully you go back and watch this video, we still see the rushing and reacting, overreacting, kind of that rushed nature of Robert Whittaker in those blitzes. Okay, he keeps coming on and on. But Israel, because he does get so attuned and so sensitive to the information and the affordances from one's opponent, really, really rapidly, and especially if they are acting in big, exaggerated or magnified intense actions, we find that he's able to start setting these traps really right from the start. And that's what the feints do. And so you see, again, well, let's look at the bottom or the picture over here on the left, 144 to go in the first round. And he starts to act in ways that really try to draw someone in. Look at him here. He's standing heavy on that left leg. And I know you can't see my legs, but hope you can see his. He lets the head come on out there. It's not only now to perceive a different affordance or to perceive from a different vista, if you will, okay, to get a different perspective. But look at what he does with his perceptual degrees of freedom when he does it. His eyes will sometimes be down, and if you watch it in slow motion, you're going to see his eyes go down, up, okay? And you're going to see him move here, and it's not just his head moving, kind of like an owl, okay? But it's while his head moves, his eyes do as well. They go from chest to shoulders to head. And all of that is just a really high level perceptual sensitivity, okay? The only way to truly train that is in context. I don't care what anybody says. You're not training that out of context. You're training a connection to the unique problem. But in this case, now that he has that sensitivity, he's actually baiting and deceiving Robert Whittaker into acting in a certain way. He has found a home for the check hook on both sides, southpaw and orthodox. Now, I know I just showed like that looping action, but hopefully it makes some sense. Like as Robert Whittaker was starting to come in pressure on into him, he was starting to find his way, he being Israel Adesanya, finding a way to do less circling and to load himself, coil himself, and give check hooks right here, or give a check hook and escape. Okay, so he's actually trying to draw him in now. He's setting these traps through his feints and looking for a home for the hook. Okay, and as Bruce Lee said in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, we must surprise our opponent and catch his moment of helplessness. So Israel Adesanya in this trap setting is deceiving purposely. Okay, he tries it here on the left-hand side. He says, look it, here's my head, come hit me. And because he's so sensitive and aware, he's very comfortable if Robert Whittaker starts coming in and blitzing and throwing those punches, because he wants to take 1 or 2 steps back. Adesanya wants to take 1 or 2 steps back and give him the check hook. So 144 to go, he's already starting to do that. And this happened a lot more than just these 3 snapshots. Then we see one later on, 1 minute and 20 seconds later, this big hip feint, okay? He's trying to look for that reaction. I'm going to kick at you. I want you to come and move one way or another. And I'm looking for that opportunity. He's trying to get those big reactions from him. Still doesn't get it here in either one of these shots, which Robert Whittaker was very undisciplined at times, at least for a Robert Whittaker fight, and then disciplined at another. Like he almost like got lulled into this way of entering the fire in exchanging. And right shortly after this, between this moment and this one, Izzy actually does enter the fire with him, or maybe it's right before that actually. Have to go back and look at the video, but you start to see him act in kind of unorthodox ways, him being Adesanya acting in unorthodox ways in order to try to draw Robert Whittaker into that trap. I don't want you guys to miss this if you go back and look at the fight. Here we see him go into a capoeira. This is at the very tail end, guys and gals. I think there's 9 or 10 seconds left at this point. Maybe when he starts this capoeira Jenga type of action. It's very expressive, it's very authentic, but it's actually one that allows one to move left and right with ease at the drop of a hat. Okay, so he actually goes from this right hip, he moves and slices in a bounding type of fashion over here to the left to try to draw Robert Whittaker in. And that's exactly what happens and unfolds. Pretty masterpiece type of stuff. You can see here now, let's just think about what just unfolded from this and what this interpersonal distance is saying. Israel Adesanya goes to his left, right? And we get here. He coils to his left, again, still with the ability to go left or right if he needs to, depending on how his opponent behaves and interacts. Robert Whittaker comes in, and you'll sometimes see this action from Izzy when he's at the warning track, meaning when he's over here in the ads, like outside of the inner octagon. But he has such a fine octagon control that he's able to still move left and right. And of course, the degeneracy or abundance within his system really allows for it as well. So if he can equally and adeptly throw shots, kicks, punches, do grapples, clenches, etc., from left and right equally as well, it allows one to have the opportunity to do this. Huge carryover, huge analogy here that could be utilized to have transference to other sports. Okay, so kind of think about that. It's something that we've talked a lot about over time here at Football Beyond the Stats or in our movement analysis. So now he draws him in, and right after this point, he actually takes his right foot, moves it back as Robert Whittaker keeps coming in. See my mouse on the picture? Okay, hopefully you guys can see my mouse anyway. He continues to get drawn in. And now we see Robert Whittaker, big looping action with his own right hook. Izzy, in a disciplined fashion, reacts, and I hate to use that word reacts. He picks up the information about this looping action and he sits back on it, moves this left arm here to just subtly use as a blocker, and one right hook, right obviously to the chin. In the second picture is actually a second right hook. So he gives one and the head is still there. He was still leaning off of it, and he gives a second one up and through with tremendous leverage, tremendous power, and explodes up and through Robert Whittaker's face. And as this happens, it obviously leads to a knockdown that could have, if this was taking place right, literally Saved by the Bell at the very, very end of the first round. If there would have been 10, 15 seconds left to go, there is no doubt, because Robert Whittaker was out on his feet, there is no doubt that Robert Whittaker would have been stopped at this moment in time. So early round 2, now, again, all of that kind of creates this platform for us to investigate that movement behavior, which gets channeled. Remember, this fight actually only ends up going through this round or into this round, and it gets ended rather, I shouldn't say early or quickly. I think there was like a minute and a half to go in this round. We look at what happens here. Remember, they're coming out after that first round knocked down. Robert Whittaker puts his hand up like he wants to touch gloves, like it would be sort of traditional to start the fight. In Israel Adesanya, look at his body behavior right here, or his mannerisms, and he's like, like their time for respect is over at this moment. The time for respect will come at the very, very end of the fight. But right now, you are mine, okay? And I think when Robert Whittaker does this, it already kind of shows the writing on the wall. Like it's a desperation mode to a certain degree. This is when they're coming out. Look at his face right here. Remember, just 30 seconds, 45 seconds earlier, he was knocked down, knocked out. Okay, so think about what that would do to one's perceptions, intentions, and actions, and the ability to read information or pick up information and then act upon it is very, very nil at that point. So fixed and frozen degrees of freedom, even more so than what we typically would have throughout the first round. Yet, to give kudos and props to Robert Whittaker, He comes out attacking, as we see here, 4:55, just 5 seconds have gone by in that first round. And he comes out attacking. And there was, they're obviously UFC fighters, mixed martial artists as a whole, specifically the higher level elite ones, are a different breed of human. Like, no one, myself included, could possibly actually, and this would apply to all other athletes, I believe, as well. Like, people can't really understand what makes a UFC elite level fighter tick like this. Like, you just got knocked out. Obviously, you don't have all your bearings back. You're not yourself. You don't have access to your full skill set. And you got to go out in front of the most dangerous man in the division and let him pick you apart a little bit more. Like, this is a different psyche. So kudos to Robert Whittaker, obviously, for coming out and being like, I'm not shying away from my game plan necessarily. I just got knocked down / knocked out. I'm coming out firing. That's a different style of human right there than most people are. But that being said, Izzy is so much in his flow now at this point. And as he says on his video, round 2, and he himself did a video, he himself being Israel Adesanya, did a breakdown video of this a year and a half back of this fight. And he said, I was frying his brain. Like, and he was. If you haven't seen this fight, or if you've never seen an Israel Adesanya fight, think of the Paulo Costa fight that he had that came up 2 fights after this one, where it was, again, 2 undefeated guys, Paulo Costa being this incredible Hulk of the man, right? And he literally comes out, he being Adesanya, comes out and fries his brain by the information that he's throwing at them. Like, you never know what's coming, when it's coming, and there are levels to this, as Israel Adesanya himself says. If you watch an Israel Adesanya fight in slow motion, you will start to see what it is that we're talking about and why it is that he is such an exemplar of dexterity. Now, that doesn't mean, especially at this level of fighting, that he can't get beat or knocked down. And that happens. You're fighting against other ones that are the best in the world. And obviously, he lost to Jan Blachowicz last March, when he moved up a weight, which we'll talk about as well. But you can see here through the fight, that frying of a brain, where Israel Adesanya has such a finely attuned, sensitive perceptual attunement, just barely getting missed. Okay, Robert Whittaker is missing and finding air where typically he would find a home for some of these shots. Okay, but Izzy, so attuned, so sensitive, and this is part of the thing that makes his skill set resonate so deeply with me and the way that I view the world. You also start to see him here, like in this action, he starts to give some of these feints in different ways. He starts to throw out arm actions that typically they wouldn't come from that area. So he's just trying to get this information overload in this information transaction. Again, between Whittaker and Izzy, there's going to be this mutual reciprocal exchange of information based on how each individual behaves. As Gibson says, behavior affords behavior. So the behaviors of one means certain affordances or opportunities for another. And he's trying to actually get an opportunity to take Robert Whittaker out. He's frying his brain by giving him too many options, too many opportunities, too many affordances to be able to accurately perceive and pick up. And that's really, as we go into this, he just keeps giving him more feinting here, okay? And you can see that, and he's drawing out certain actions. And now, because there is that frying of the brain, Robert Whittaker isn't behaving as much in the reactive blitzing type of nature in response, but he's more fixed, more frozen. You can just see the perceptions, his intentions or decisions and his actions really just become reduced to lower levels of skill than he actually possesses, or than that he typically fights with. And now he starts to freeze him a bit. And of course, to the middle of round 2, he's now he knows that he has him hurt, and he has him hurt a couple more times because of that fixed and frozen nature. I think there were at least 2 more times within early second round where he has Robert Whittaker on the ropes. He has him dead to rights. He has him rocked, and he knows that the writing is on the wall. But Israel Adesanya is a very patient individual, very intentional. So there's a skilled intentionality. There's an openness and responsiveness to a wide range of opportunities. So even though he knocked him down and knocked him out with the right check hook earlier, now the second knockdown or knockout, the true knockout of the fight, comes from a left check hook, executed in an abundant fashion, meaning it looks awfully similar to that which what we saw from the right hand side. Now from the left, the right hand just pushes the head of Robert Whittaker into this path, and Izzy actually eats a shot to let him come into range, but he pushes his head, his being Whittaker's head, into Izzy's path for that left check hook. That now look at the leaning position that he's in. Again, you got to have the action capabilities and the effectivities of acting upon the world in a given way to be able to perceive the affordance for it, right? For the affordance or open or opportunity to be there, to be of an inviting enough strength, you have to have the way of acting upon it. And Izzy has capable action capabilities, right side and left. And now we see that action flexibly adapted and adjusted from the right side to the left, and it looks awfully similar. Down Robert Whittaker goes, and Izzy goes to his machine gun celebration down here, just signifying the fact that he has taken out the entire middleweight division and now is running back through them at this point, at least. But this crowning moment came because of the dexterity, but the dexterity was expressed through an attunement of skill, the attunement of perception, as well as a skilled intentionality, an openness and responsiveness to the landscape of affordances, behaving in interaction with that which what Robert Whittaker was getting him, an opportunity that in the first round was on the other side, now is over and flipped. And then also a true abundance that led to adaptability and adapting it to the nature of the situation. So we fast forward now to where we're at in the different constraints in this one. Both of them have 3 wins in the middleweight division since that fight in 2019. So now 2.5 years later, both of them have amassed 3 wins. Izzy actually had 4 fights, lost one of them to Jan Blachowicz when he went up last March, like I said, to try and win and become the double champ, to try and win the light heavyweight championship. So no small feat to be able to go up a weight class and then be outweighed by probably 20, 25 pounds and try to match one's skill. Also, there's some opportunities there. And there's something that we're going to talk about here specifically for Robert Whittaker heading forward. So both guys, their skill has improved. They were at their peak. They were in their prime back 2.5 years ago. Their prime has lasted, and we could be in for a treat because of it. Okay, so there are some things to take from this. So opportunities right off the bat for Izzy. I would say first and foremost, and this won't come as a shocker or surprise for me to say this about a kickboxer, right? And about a kickboxer trying to find functional adaptability of that skill in different contexts or across contexts. I think the opportunity, even though we did see it like we see it from up in the upper left-hand corner, we saw the kicking game of Izzy in UFC 243 versus Whittaker, but we didn't see the full breadth of the kicking game like we did and like he has executed and expressed across the fights that took place subsequently. Okay, the Yoel Romero fight, the Paulo Costa fight especially, and the Marvin Vettori fight especially. And what I'd like to see more from Izzy in this fight is because he used his hands so much and he found the opportunities to use the hands so much in that first matchup against Whittaker, there might be some opportunity here for him to express himself through the kicking game more. I'd like to see that kicking game, like I've showed on the pictures, with variability. So variability, 2 different targets, okay? Go to the body, go to the head, go to the legs. Out of both stances, southpaw and orthodox. Now he was primarily an orthodox once he found that functional fit, specifically as he searched for a home for those hooks, okay? But he ultimately found the hook from the left, right? So go to the legs, particularly the knee and shin potentially, because Robert Whittaker sits heavy on his front leg. So even though we saw it in that first fight, there was a lot of bouncing back and forth here, he will often, he being Whittaker, will push and sit on that front leg in that karate style stance. So that calf and that leg will be there. There will be a home for it. And find his different looks, right side and left side, with a variety of targets and a variety of styles that will set up a home for potentially the question mark kick that Izzy uses better than anybody else in the game, where it looks like it's coming lower at the knee, and guys don't try to check it, or they might bring their hands down to try and push it down and away. Then it wraps up and slaps somebody right around the head and the neck. Okay. So because of that lead leg being exposed, there's going to be an opening there, like what we probably found in the Costa fight, the Paulo Costa fight. And that fight is, I think they have that fight free on UFC right now as well. There were also some times, like we see here on the upper left-hand corner for Izzy, where he missed some high kicks, or he had some kicks, straight kicks, middle kicks right down the middle against Robert Whittaker that just barely missed. The opportunity can and will be there for this. And I think he will have to find an opportunity to go get them, because he will have to do more to move his feet and circle away, because I believe that Robert Whittaker will have found an opportunity. By the way, that is, we see on the upper left hand, okay, again, behavior affords behavior. And anytime that you find yourself in a certain behavior, there are openings, opportunities, and affordances for your opponent. Now, realize that the opportunities for Whittaker, I showed nothing but pictures of Israel Adesanya here. Obviously, you're one picture with Whittaker up on the upper left-hand corner. But this, look at the time here. This was that kick and blitz that came right at the beginning of the second round. There was an opportunity here, and there was an opportunity throughout the fight for the takedown in a number of cases. But Robert Whittaker was so fixed and so frozen with his movement strategies and solutions that he started to blitz really, like, I mean, it was just a bull and a matador, right? As I pointed out earlier. I'd like to see a little bit more cerebral blitzing from Robert Whittaker if I were him or in his camp, where he's looking to counter more. Let Izzy come to you a few more times. So even though Izzy's going to be feinting and faking, and you might react at times, stand your ground a little bit. Be more cerebral. Don't try to blitz him with all the anger and with all the ego. Okay. And then when you do attack, go more for the body, because we're talking about a long, lean, slender guy, a tall guy, 6'4" versus 6 foot, 6'4" and Izzy, 6 foot and Whittaker, and obviously a 7-inch reach advantage as well. So go to the body to kind of chop Izzy down, attack and punish the body, and blitz more cerebrally. When you blitz more cerebrally, that could potentially open the opportunity for obviously the level change and into the takedown, like what we see from Jan Blachowicz here. Okay. There might also be an opportunity if he starts kicking your leg, he being Izzy, like Marvin Vettori actually caught Izzy's leg on a couple of cases. Okay. Even though Izzy was chewing up Vettori's leg and ends up winning that fight very handedly, Vettori did get him to the ground because he caught the kick that went lower at the knee. And there might be an opportunity there for Whittaker. But when you do that level change just doesn't come. Like, Izzy is hard to take down. You're talking about one of the world's greatest or most sophisticated strikers to have ever walked the face of the planet, maybe the most, particularly in the UFC today. He works a lot on takedowns, and it's very obvious. His takedown defense is very dexterous. Okay. So you're not just going to be able to take them down without giving them something ahead of time. And that's what Jan did so much different than everybody else. He punched to the body. He also did like this double punch where he jabbed, like what you see down in the bottom left here. Okay. He jabbed to the head and then a second jab to the body. Okay. So it was like a double jab, head, body, went lower with it. It would knock Izzy back, having to get put out of position for a takedown defense. Okay. The other thing that Jan did versus others, because people are going to talk about the Jan Blachowicz blueprint, right? But I mean, every fight is different. Every behavior and opponent matchup in style is different. So I don't necessarily buy into the whole Blachowicz blueprint thing. Okay. But he controlled the center. Blachowicz controlled the center a lot more than Izzy was accustomed to his opponent doing. Typically, Izzy controls the flow in the center of the octagon. And the other thing is Jan showed some different looks and changed stance switches very subtly from right side to left side, but yet Jan Blachowicz is a big dude that has like big robotic type of actions at times where he is looking for bigger striking punches, okay, or punches or strikes. And Izzy did not do a great job. And I don't know if there was something up with him physically, mentally, emotionally, etc. in March against Jan Blachowicz, because even though it was in the smaller cage, and I do think that that played and factored into it, again, it's a different environmental constraints that then set up a different palette for the athletes to behave on. You didn't see Izzy as attuned or as sensitive to opportunities. He was throwing a lot of feints and deceptive looks, but wasn't acting upon them and following them up, which again is not an Israel Adesanya style and fight. And so for whatever reason, whether it was the weight difference, whether it was a small cage, or whether it was something happening in his outside world, or maybe a combination of all those things, we didn't see the typical attuned and adaptable nature from Israel Adesanya back in March. Still ended up being a very competitive fight, but it wasn't his normal style. So for Izzy here, or excuse me, for Robert Whittaker, you need to be more methodical. You got to stop with the big exaggerated striking actions and do more of that, which what Jan Blachowicz did, or even Kelvin Gastelum, which Kelvin Gastelum and Izzy went 5 rounds for that interim championship before Izzy went and fought Robert. So just go touch him a little bit, touch him more, still blitz, touch him more, but with less anger, less aggression, less power, less strength, okay? There is a concern that I would have if I'm Israel Adesanya, or for Israel Adesanya, if I'm cheering or betting on him. And it's that, obviously, we want style bending. So we want you to honestly and authentically express yourself, but it has to be functional. It has to be purposeful. It has to be practical. It has to be relevant and fit to the problem. If Robert does start mixing in some takedowns, obviously be ready to behave in a different fashion. Whereas before he hunkered down his feet, loaded himself to look for those check hooks, and made himself a little bit more stationary target than he typically would. I don't think that's going to be the path to the fight now. You're going to have to move your feet, circle away, right or left. Again, you're equally adept at both, and look to counter with a knee, like against Derek Brunson here. And again, in this clinch against Brad Tavares, or even more creative actions like against Kelvin Gastelum when it happened. Okay. Now, there is a concern as well, like I said, that Izzy has, and whether it's the art of war and it's a mental warfare of it, Izzy has stated that he would like Robert to feel his strength. Particularly, they didn't get the clinch all that much, or there wasn't very many grappling exchanges. I am a little concerned that Izzy wants to like prove his prowess in those areas. Only look to prove that prowess if the opportunity presents itself. Okay, so that would be the big thing that I would say there. We want it to be functional. We want it to be fit to the problem, and get back to the evasive nature that we saw. Obviously, this is just one example against Marvin Vettori here down in the bottom right-hand side. You can see him now back in the warning track when a guy is pressuring. He's looking to move left or right and just ducking punches to find spots to either move or strike back. So you're taking and absorbing someone's energy, someone's own striking, dissolving it, and moving in a different way to act in relation to it. Become one with the problem. That's the functional style bender that's going to be the path to this victory. And then as I kind of wind down here, we see him practicing some additional creative, authentic and honest and expressive nature of who he is and how he is. Like, don't let anyone tell you how to behave. Behave in your own way based on the opportunities you see there. This is some stuff that he's doing with Carl Van Roon down in New Zealand, striking coach, high-level kickboxer and taekwondo guy. And this was him in the lead up. This was back in early January. Granted, he's fighting against a high school kid, I think it is, or about that type of age. But he's just out there playing in this capoeira type of style. Bring that, as long as there's functionality behind it. And now I probably should mention or say, or I do want to say, that whether it was Eugene Behrman kind of setting the art of war again in a deceptive nature, but I believe, or I heard Eugene Behrman say that they believe that their plan from UFC 243 still actually applies, because Izzy, in the moment, based on what he was picking up and what he was seeing, actually adapted to go to plan B, if you will. That they didn't actually use or incorporate and institute plan A in that fight, because they give Israel Adesanya the liberty and freedom to be who he is within the 30-foot octagon. And if that's the case, by all means, obviously I'm all for that, as you guys know here. I'm all about authenticity, all about the loose artistry and honest expression of it. And hopefully that's the case, but it could just be mental warfare too. However, I do think there's something to this, okay? And so they may have some things up their sleeves, particularly for clenching and grappling exchanges, that they didn't actually get to incorporate, and there should be more layers to that movement skill now for Izzy, just as there would be for Robert Whittaker. Now, I know that this movement behavior deep dive was very one-sided because of how biased I am towards Israel Adesanya and his style. Realize at the highest level of sport of any kind, it can go either way, right? But you can kind of see where I'm riding and why. Now, if this breakdown was something much like what I repeated on over and over again in rhetorical and redundant fashions throughout the NFL season, if you like the video, please like, subscribe, potentially share. I'm trying to build this side of what I do in these deep dives. So by all means, please feel free to share it with anyone that you feel may benefit from this. If you have your own thoughts, ideas, concerns, whatever, please feel free to put them in the comments below. And then I do want to make a mention and give a shout out to Emergence and what we're doing with our skilled movement analysis course. I appreciate everyone that has already picked it up. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, down in the show notes, I have a link for a course that myself, along with my colleague Tyler Yerby from Emergence, put together earlier this year and released earlier this year, that kind of takes you through us investigating and detailing and describing sport in this way, that then begins to set the tone for our practice and environment design as sport movement specialists. So that would be something for $77 I would highly recommend y'all picking up. But for Sean Mishka, the Movement Miyagi, Football Beyond the Stats, even though we didn't talk about football, this has been another movement behavior deep dive. I hope you guys enjoy the fight next week, and I'll talk to you guys on the flip side. Thank you so much.